Dan Rivers hated quiet stations. In his 10 years of salvage work, he'd learned that silence meant something had gone very wrong. His boots echoed against the metal floors of the abandoned mining facility as he swept his flashlight across empty corridors. The contract said this place had been evacuated 3 months ago after the ore ran dry, but something felt off. Life support was still running on emergency power, which made no sense for a place that was supposed to be completely shut down. He moved through the cargo bay, checking his scanner for anything valuable enough to justify the fuel he'd burned getting out here. Copper wiring, maybe some intact computer cores if he was lucky. The beam from his flashlight caught something in the corner and he froze. 4 pairs of eyes reflected back at him, glowing faintly in the darkness. His hand went to the pistol at his hip, but he didn't draw. Whatever was huddled in that corner wasn't moving aggressively. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out shapes. Scales, wings folded against small bodies. Dragon-like creatures, but smaller than any he'd seen in the database files. The biggest one was maybe the size of a large dog. Dan took a slow step forward. One of the creatures lifted its head weakly. Its scales were dull and he could see ribs poking through its sides. The others didn't even look up. They were beyond starving. The largest one opened its mouth. Its voice came out as a raspy whisper in broken galactic common. "Can we eat your leftovers?" Dan's chest tightened. He'd seen a lot of bad things in the Outer Rim. Pirates, slavers, corporate thugs who'd shoot you for a cargo container of spare parts. But 4 kids because that's what they were. Abandoned and starving to death in the dark? That was a new kind of cruel. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements calm. "Yeah," he said. "I've got food. Real food, not leftovers." He swung his pack off his shoulder and pulled out his meal rations. They weren't much, compressed protein bars and sealed packets of dried fruit, but it was what he had. The smallest one lifted its head at the sound of the wrapper crinkling. Its scales were silver, though covered in dust and grime. Dan broke the protein bar into pieces and held one out. Tiny claws reached for it with desperate care, and the small dragon ate it so fast Dan worried it might choke. He divided everything he had among the 4 of them. They ate like they hadn't seen food in weeks, which was probably accurate. As they ate, Dan got a better look at them. The big one had blue scales and what looked like gold markings along its neck. The second was green with darker stripes. The third had bronze scales that might have been shiny once. And the little silver one kept looking at Dan between bites like it was afraid he might disappear. "How long have you been here?" Dan asked the blue one. It took 3 tries before the creature could speak. 28 days. Maybe 29. Hard to count. The voice was feminine, he thought. Young but trying to sound strong. "Where are your adults? Your family?" The blue dragon looked away. "Dead. They brought us here to hide us. Bad people came. They fought them so we could run deeper into the station. We hid in the ventilation system. When we came back out, everyone was gone. We found emergency rations in a locker, but they ran out 16 days ago." Dan sat back on his heels. 29 days alone, half of that without food. He looked at these 4 kids and felt anger burning in his gut. What kind of galaxy let this happen? His ship's AI pinged in his earpiece. "Dan, I'm detecting life signs. 4 non-human entities. You need to report this to Station Authority." "There is no Station Authority," Dan muttered. "Place is abandoned. Then you need to report to the nearest Galactic Council outpost. Unauthorized transportation of alien life forms is a Class 3 violation." Dan looked at the 4 dragons. The little silver one had fallen asleep with its head on his boot. The others were watching him with eyes that had seen too much. "Yeah, well, I'm not leaving them here to die," he said. "Dan, think about this. Your salvage license can go to hell." He stood up carefully, trying not to wake the small one. "Listen up. I've got a ship about half a kilometer from here. Can you walk?" The blue dragon struggled to its feet. The others followed, moving like every step hurt. "We can walk." It took them almost an hour to reach the Wanderer. Dan had to carry the little silver one the last 100 meters because it just couldn't go any further. Its siblings pressed close to Dan like they were afraid of losing sight of him. Once inside his ship, Dan pointed to the cargo hold. "There's blankets in the storage locker. Food in the galley. Water from the tap. Help yourselves. I need to prep for departure." The blue dragon looked up at him. "Why are you helping us?" Dan thought about that. He could say it was the right thing to do. He could say he couldn't leave kids to die. But the real answer was simpler. Because someone asked me for food and I had some. Doesn't seem like it needs to be more complicated than that. He climbed the ladder to the cockpit and started running through his launch sequence. Behind him, he could hear the dragons exploring the ship with small sounds of wonder. The green one called out that it had found the food dispenser. The bronze one was already asking questions about how the ship worked. Dan pulled up the navigation charts. Nearest station was 3 days away. He'd figure out what to do when he got there. Right now, these kids needed safety, food, and rest. His AI spoke again. You realize this changes everything. Dan engaged the engines and felt the ship lift off. Through the cockpit window, he watched the abandoned station fall away into the darkness of space. Yeah, he said quietly. I know. The little silver dragon climbed into the cockpit and curled up in the co-pilot seat, watching Dan with curious eyes. It didn't say anything, just watched like it was trying to memorize his face. Dan reached over and gently patted its head. The dragon made a sound like a purr. All right then, Dan said to himself. Let's see where this goes. Behind him, he heard one of the others laugh at something. An actual laugh. It was the first sound of joy he'd heard since boarding that dead station. Maybe his AI was right. Maybe this did change everything. But as Dan set the autopilot and headed down to make sure his unexpected passengers were settling in okay, he found he didn't really care about the complications. 4 kids had asked him for help. The rest was just details. 3 days in space gave Dan time to learn things about his passengers that made his simple rescue a lot more complicated. The blue dragon's name was Lyra, and she was the eldest at what Dan guessed was equivalent to a human teenager. Reed was the green one, quiet and thoughtful, always watching everything with sharp eyes. Finn, the bronze dragon, couldn't stop asking questions about how everything worked. And little Pip, the silver one, had decided that Dan was the most fascinating thing in the entire universe, and followed him everywhere. They were sitting in the common area when Lyra finally told him the truth. Dan had made them actual cooked food this time, heating up some of his frozen rations into something that almost resembled a real meal. The 4 dragons ate slowly now, savoring it instead of desperately gulping like those first hours. We need to tell you something, Lyra said, setting down her bowl. You deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into. Dan had been waiting for this. He'd done some research during his sleep shift, pulling up what little information the galactic database had on their species. Most of it was listed under historical files. You're Draconith. I thought your species was extinct. Reed spoke up for the first time in hours. Not extinct. Nearly extinct. There's a difference. His voice was measured, careful with each word. A plague hit our homeworld 30 years ago. It killed 98% of our population within 3 months. Biological warfare, Finn added bitterly. Nobody proved it, but everyone knows. Lyra's tail swished nervously. What they don't know is that some of us survived. Small groups scattered across different colonies. We've been in hiding ever since. Some species would prefer we stayed extinct. Why? Dan asked, though he was starting to guess the answer. Because before the plague, the Draconith were the mediators of the galaxy, Reed said. When 2 species went to war, we stepped in. When trade disputes got violent, we negotiated peace. We were strong enough that both sides listened and fair enough that both sides trusted us. My people stopped 17 major wars and hundreds of smaller conflicts over 4,000 years. Dan whistled low. That's a lot of people who might hold grudges. Yes, Lyra said quietly. And we're not just any survivors. We're the royal clutch, the last children of the ruling family. The ship's engines hummed in the silence that followed. Dan processed this information slowly. He'd rescued royalty. Alien dragon royalty. No wonder someone had tried so hard to kill them. Pip climbed into Dan's lap without asking. The little dragon had done this frequently over the past 3 days. Are you mad? Pip asked in a small voice. Mad? No, concerned? Yes. Dan scratched behind Pip's ears the way he'd learned the little one liked. Tell me the rest. Lyra explained it all. Their parents had died in the plague, but their caretakers had managed to escape with the 4 of them. They'd been moving from hiding place to hiding place for years. Someone always found them eventually. The attack on the station had been the worst one yet. Their guardians had held off the assassins long enough for the cubs to escape into the ventilation system. We heard the fighting. Finn said quietly. It lasted 3 hours. Then nothing. We waited 2 days before coming out. Everyone was gone. Bodies, weapons, everything. Someone cleaned it all up. Professional, Dan muttered. Very professional. Reed nodded. We knew we couldn't signal for help. Whoever attacked us might intercept it, so we waited. We thought maybe someone friendly would come. We didn't think anyone would come at all. Why would they leave you alive? Dan asked. If they wanted you dead, why not search the station? Lyra and Reed exchanged glances. We think they did search, but we have some abilities that most people don't know about. I can feel emotions from other beings. When the hunters were close, I knew. We moved through the vents and stayed ahead of them. I remember everything I've ever seen or heard, Reed added. I knew every route through that station after the first day. Finn held up a claw and sparks danced between his talons. I can manipulate electromagnetic fields. Messed with their scanners every time they got close. Dan looked at Pip. And you? Pip curled up tighter in his lap. I'm too small to have abilities yet. They protected me. Something in Dan's chest twisted. These weren't just refugee kids. They were scared children who'd had to use everything they had just to survive being hunted like animals. His ship's AI chimed in. Dan, we're approaching the outer checkpoint for Haven Station. You'll need to declare any cargo or passengers. This was the moment. Dan could turn them over to the authorities, claim he found them, get them into official channels, wash his hands of the whole complicated mess. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. He looked down at Pip, who was watching him with complete trust in those silver eyes. How do you feel about being cargo? Dan asked the four of them. Technically, I could list you as salvage. Biological samples require less paperwork than sentient passengers. Lyra's eyes widened. You're going to smuggle us through? Unless you've got a better idea. Once we're through the checkpoint, we'll have options. I know some people who know other people. We can figure out where to go from there. Reed tilted his head. You understand this makes you a criminal. Smuggling is serious. Your salvage license will probably get revoked the moment they figure out what I'm doing. Dan finished. Yeah, I know. But here's the thing. You asked me for leftovers 3 days ago. 4 starving kids asked me for scraps, and I can't just hand you over to whoever's in charge and hope they do the right thing. The galaxy hasn't done right by you so far. Finn made a sound like a laugh. You're insane. In a good way. But still insane. Probably, Dan agreed. He gently moved Pip to the seat beside him and stood up. All right, here's the plan. There's a hidden compartment in the lower cargo hold. It was meant for smuggling high-value salvage past tax inspections. It's got air circulation and basic life support. You 4 will hide there during the inspection. Don't make noise, don't move around. Reed, can you remember exactly what I'm about to tell you about the station layout? Every word, Reed confirmed. Dan spent the next hour explaining emergency routes through Haven Station, just in case things went wrong. He showed them how to access the external airlock controls. He gave Lyra his secondary communicator with a list of contacts, people who might help if he couldn't. When it was time, the 4 dragons climbed into the hidden compartment. It was cramped for 4 growing dragons, but they made it work. Pip grabbed Dan's hand before he closed the panel. You'll come back for us? The little dragon asked. I promise, Dan said. He meant it with everything he had. The inspection took 20 minutes that felt like hours. A bored station officer scanned his cargo hold, checked his manifest, and barely looked at Dan himself. Lot of empty space for a salvage runner, the officer noted. Last run didn't pan out, Dan said truthfully. Whole station stripped clean before I got there. The officer grunted and stamped his clearance. Bay 7, don't cause trouble. As soon as the inspection shuttle detached, Dan opened the compartment. 4 dragons tumbled out, breathing hard. Pip immediately climbed up his leg to his shoulder. That was terrifying, Lyra said. Welcome to being a smuggler, Dan replied. Come on, we need to resupply and figure out our next move. Later, after they'd docked and Dan had secured the ship, he found all 4 dragons asleep in a pile in his personal quarters. They'd dragged every blanket they could find into a nest and were curled around each other. Pip had one of Dan's shirts pulled close like a stuffed animal. Dan grabbed his spare blanket and settled into the co-pilot seat for the night. His back would hate him in the morning, but somehow that seemed like a small price to pay. His communicator buzzed with a new message. Unknown sender, encrypted. He opened it. The message was simple and terrifying. We know what you're carrying. The bounty is 50 million credits, dead or alive. Dan looked back toward his quarters where 4 children slept, finally feeling safe enough to rest deeply. Well, he said to himself. This just got interesting. He began making a list of who he could trust and where they could possibly run. It was a short list and the options weren't great, but he'd figure something out. He had to. 4 kids were counting on him. Haven Station smelled like recycled air, fried food, and desperation. Dan kept the 4 dragons close as they moved through the crowded market district, their hoods pulled up to hide their distinctive features. It wasn't a perfect disguise, but in a place like Haven, most people knew better than to look too closely at anything that wasn't their business. Dan needed supplies and information, in that order. The bounty message had made one thing clear: they couldn't stay anywhere too long. But running required credits and his accounts were getting thin. Salvage work didn't pay well even when you weren't busy becoming a wanted criminal. Stay together, he told the 4 of them. Reed, you're tracking our route? The green dragon nodded from beneath his hood. Every turn. I can get us back to the ship from anywhere in the station. They'd made it 3 blocks into the market when Dan spotted her. The woman was leaning against a support pillar, watching them with the kind of focused attention that made Dan's instincts scream danger. She was human, maybe 50 years old, with gray streaking through her dark hair and scars on her hands that spoke of hard living. Before Dan could change direction, she pushed off the pillar and walked straight toward them. Her hand wasn't on her weapon, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. Dan Rivers, she said. Not a question. Depends on who's asking. Dan's hand drifted toward his pistol. Oren Vale. I served with your brother. She said it quietly, but the words hit Dan like a physical blow. His older brother had died 12 years ago in a mercenary action gone wrong. Dan rarely talked about it. You have 10 seconds to explain what you want, Dan said. Oren glanced at the 4 hooded figures behind Dan. Somewhere more private. There are at least 3 bounty hunters in this market right now, and 2 of them have already made you. Lyra's hand found Dan's arm. Through their brief time together, he'd learned to read her moods. She was afraid, but trying not to show it. She's telling the truth, Lyra whispered. About the hunters. I can feel them watching. Dan made a decision based on nothing but a name and the desperate need for help. Lead the way. Oren took them through a maintenance corridor that required a security bypass. She had it open in seconds. They emerged in a quieter section of the station, near the docking bays for private ships. She led them into a small cargo office and locked the door. Your brother saved my life, Oren said without preamble. He took a shot meant for me. I promised myself that if I ever had a chance to help his family, I would. Figured I'd never get the opportunity since you went into salvage instead of merc work. Then I heard rumors about a human salvage runner smuggling something valuable through Haven. Did some checking. Your ship registration came up. That doesn't explain why you're helping instead of collecting the bounty, Dan said. 50 million is a lot of credits, Oren admitted. But some things matter more than money. Your brother taught me that before he died. Also, I looked into who's offering the bounty. The consortium. Corporate scum who see the whole galaxy as merchandise. I don't work for them. Finn spoke up from beneath his hood. How long before the hunters find us? You're already found, Oren said bluntly. Question is whether we can get you out before they move. Haven Station has rules. No weapons fire in the public areas. No killing where civilians can see it. But in about 30 minutes, shift change happens at the security office. That's when they'll hit you. Probably try to grab the kids, kill you if you resist. Dan felt ice in his stomach. How many? I counted 3 teams. Maybe 12 hunters total. All professionals. Oren looked at the hooded figures. I'm guessing these are the dragon cubs everyone's talking about. The ones from the dead royal family. Lyra pushed back her hood. We prefer not to be talked about like cargo. Oren studied her for a moment, then nodded with what looked like respect. Fair enough. You fight? We've had to, Lyra said. Then here's what's going to happen, Oren said. She pulled up a station map on her datapad. Dan's ship is in Bay 7, too far and too exposed. My ship is in Bay 12, closer and with better access. We move there, get everyone aboard, and burn out of Haven before station security realizes what happened. What about the hunters? Reed asked. Oren smiled, and it wasn't friendly. We go through them. The next 20 minutes were tense preparation. Oren had weapons stashed in the cargo office, which she distributed. Dan took a rifle he was moderately comfortable with. The dragons had to make do with their natural abilities, though Lyra insisted they knew how to fight. They moved through the service corridors in single file. Oren led, Dan brought up the rear. The dragons stayed in the middle, alert and quiet. They'd almost made it to Bay 12 when the first hunter stepped out ahead of them. He was a Vrax, a species known for their tough hide and love of violence. End of the line, human. Give us the dragons and you can walk away. Counteroffer, Oren said. You leave now and you keep breathing. The Vrax laughed. His friends appeared from side corridors. 4 more hunters, all armed, all dangerous. Now, Lyra said quietly. Finn thrust his claws forward, and every weapon in the corridor sparked and died, their electronic components fried by an electromagnetic pulse. The hunters stared at their useless guns for 1 surprise second. That was all the time Oren and Dan needed. They moved like professionals, using stun batons instead of guns in the tight space. Dan took down 2 hunters before they recovered from their shock. Oren fought like someone who'd spent decades in combat, efficient and brutal. But they were still outnumbered. A hunter got past Dan and lunged for Pip. The little silver dragon dodged with surprising speed, but the hunter was fast too. His hand closed around Pip's tail. Reed and Finn hit the hunter from both sides, their weight and momentum sending all 3 crashing into the wall. Lyra stepped in and struck the hunter's head with her tail, the blow calculated and precise. The hunter went down hard. Move, Oren shouted. Alarms were blaring now. Station security would arrive in minutes. They ran the last 100 meters to Bay 12. Oren's ship was a modified transport built for speed and trouble. The boarding ramp was already lowering as they approached. They scrambled inside and Oren hit the controls to seal the ship. Strap in, she called out. This launch is going to be rough. Dan got the 4 dragons into crash seats and locked the safety harnesses. Pip was shaking but trying to hide it. You did good, Dan told him. All of you did. We hurt people, Pip said quietly. People who were trying to kidnap you, Dan said firmly. That's not wrong. That's survival. The ship's engines roared to life. Through the viewport, Dan could see station security arriving at the bay. Oren didn't wait for clearance. She fired the main thrusters and the ship shot forward, breaching the docking bay barrier in a shower of sparks. Warning alarms screamed as they cleared the station. 3 pursuit ships were scrambling to follow them. Oren pushed the engines hard, weaving through the debris field outside Haven with the kind of skill that came from years of running from trouble. Can we outrun them? Lyra asked, gripping her seat as the ship banked hard. Don't need to outrun them, Oren said. Just need to get clear of their weapons range, then we jump to hyperspace. She threw the ship into a spiral that made Dan's stomach lurch. 30 seconds. The pursers fired, but Oren was already moving, the shots passing through empty space. She counted down under her breath and hit the hyperspace jump at exactly the right moment. The stars stretched and they were gone, leaving Haven and the hunters behind. In the sudden quiet of hyperspace, everyone took a breath. Pip had grabbed Dan's hand during the escape and hadn't let go. Finn was grinning with relief. Reed looked thoughtful, probably already analyzing everything that had happened. Lyra was watching Oren with careful respect. Where are we going? Dan asked. New Perth, Oren said. It's an independent human colony out past the frontier. They don't like the Galactic Council much and they really don't like being told what to do. If anywhere will give us shelter, it's there. Dan nodded slowly. A human colony. That might work. Or it might just be delaying the inevitable. The bounty was too high and too public now. More hunters would come, but for now they were safe. 4 kids who'd been through hell were safe for another day. Thank you, Lyra said to Oren, for helping us. Oren glanced back at her. Thank your guardian there. I did this for him and his brother. But you're decent kids. That counts for something too. Pip finally let go of Dan's hand and curled up in the seat, exhausted. Within minutes, all 4 dragons were asleep, the stress and fear finally catching up to them. Dan and Oren sat in the cockpit, watching the swirl of hyperspace. They really are just kids, Oren said quietly. Yeah, Dan agreed. They are. And someone wants them dead badly enough to offer 50 million credits. Also, yeah. Oren was quiet for a moment. Your brother would have done the same thing. Protected them, I mean. No matter the cost, he was always better at the hero thing than me, Dan said. Maybe, Oren said. Or maybe you're more like him than you think. Dan didn't have an answer for that. He just watched the 4 sleeping dragons and wondered how much harder this was going to get before it got better. He had a feeling he'd find out soon enough. New Perth wasn't impressive from orbit. The colony was only 40 years old, built on a marginal planet that barely met habitable standards. But what it lacked in beauty, it made up for in stubborn independence. The colony had fought off 3 corporate takeover attempts and told the Galactic Council to mind its own business on at least a dozen occasions. Governor Ruth Chen met them personally at the spaceport. She was a short woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble. She looked at the 4 dragons with interest but not surprise. "The message said you were bringing refugees," Ruth said to Orin. "Didn't mention they were famous." "Are we famous?" Pip asked quietly from behind Dan's leg. Ruth smiled, and it softened her hard features. "Kid, your faces have been on every news channel in the galaxy for the past 2 days. Someone leaked footage from Haven Station. The whole galaxy knows about the last Draconeth royal cubs and the human who's protecting them." Dan felt his stomach drop. "That's not good." "Depends on your perspective," Ruth said. She gestured for them to follow her into the administration building. "You're not the first people to come to New Perth running from trouble. Won't be the last either. Question is, what are you planning to do?" Inside her office, Ruth pulled up a news feed on her screen. Dan watched himself fighting hunters in a corridor. Watched Finn fry their weapons with electromagnetic pulses. Watched Lyra coordinate her siblings with tactical precision. The footage was grainy but clear enough. "Humanity's reaction has been interesting," Ruth said. She switched to another feed. "Social media is calling you the Dragon Dad. There are support groups organizing. 3 different human colonies have offered asylum. Even Earth's government issued a statement supporting your right to protect the cubs." Reed leaned forward, studying the screen with his perfect memory, cataloging everything. "Why do humans care? We're not your species." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "Kid, that's a complicated question with a simple answer. Humans have a thing about protecting children. Any children? Doesn't matter if they're human or not. Something about how we evolved, maybe. We pack bond with everything." "Pack bond?" Lyra asked. "It means we form emotional connections easily," Dan explained. "Humans domesticated wolves into dogs. We keep cats even though they're useless for work. We name our ships and our vehicles. We adopt alien species and call them family. It's what we do." Finn tilted his head. "That sounds like a survival disadvantage. Caring about things that don't benefit you?" "Maybe," Ruth said. "But it also means when someone threatens our pack, we fight back. And right now a lot of humans have decided 4 dragon kids count as pack." She pulled up another feed. "The consortium issued a statement this morning demanding that New Perth hand you over. They claim you're stolen property of the Draconeth people and need to be placed in proper custody." "We're not property," Lyra said sharply. "I know that. You know that. But the consortium sees everything in terms of assets and leverage." Ruth leaned back in her chair. "Here's the situation. If I grant you asylum, the consortium will probably blockade us. They have enough ships to choke our supply lines. We're self-sufficient for food, but we need medical supplies, technology, parts. A blockade could hurt us bad." Dan stood up. "Then we'll leave. I won't let this colony suffer because of us." "Sit down," Ruth said firmly. "I'm not finished. I called a colony vote last night. Asked every citizen whether we should grant you asylum despite the risks. Vote was 78% in favor. The other 22% abstained because they wanted to vote yes but were worried about their neighbors. Not one person voted to turn you away." She pulled up footage of the colony hall packed with people. Dan could see faces of all ages, all backgrounds, all looking determined. "Humans are stubborn," Ruth said. "We don't like being told what to do, especially by corporate thugs. And we really don't like seeing kids used as bargaining chips. So yes, you have asylum here for as long as you need it." Pip moved out from behind Dan and looked up at Ruth. "You're risking your whole colony for us?" "Honey, we're not risking our colony. We're defending our principles." "There's a difference." Ruth knelt down to Pip's level. "You're safe here. All of you." The next few days showed Dan what it meant to be part of a human colony. Families brought food to their temporary housing. Teachers offered to help educate the dragons. Children approached shyly to ask if they could be friends with the alien kids. It was overwhelming and genuine in equal measure. Lyra spent hours talking with Ruth about human culture and politics. Reed haunted the colony's library, absorbing every book and file he could find about human history. Finn made friends with the engineering crews and learned about human technology. Pip followed Dan everywhere but was slowly warming up to other humans, especially the colony's children. On the 4th day, a ship arrived without warning. It broadcast Draconeth identification codes that hadn't been heard in 30 years. Dan's heart raced as he watched it land in the main spaceport. The delegation that emerged was led by a scarred dragon at least twice the size of Lyra. His scales were dark red, marked with old battle damage. He wore military insignia that Dan's database identified as high-ranking Draconeth military. Behind him came 6 more dragons, all warriors, all looking like they'd seen serious combat. "I am General Thorn of the Draconeth Remnant," the dragon announced. "I have come for the royal cubs." Dan stepped forward, putting himself between Thorn and the 4 young dragons. "They're under my protection." Thorn looked at Dan like he was an amusing insect. "Human, you do not understand what you are doing. These children are the future of our species. They belong with their own kind, being trained for their responsibilities. They need Draconeth teachers, Draconeth culture, Draconeth discipline. They need safety in a childhood," Dan said, "not to be turned into symbols or weapons. You dare?" Thorn's voice was dangerous. "You are not their parent. You are not Draconeth. You have no right to make decisions for royal heirs." Lyra stepped around Dan. "General Thorn, I remember you from when I was very young. You served my parents." Thorn's expression softened slightly. "Princess Lyra, yes, I was honored to serve them. It is my honor now to return you and your siblings to your people." "Our people are dead," Lyra said bluntly, "killed by plague or assassins or politics. The Draconeth who remain are scattered and hiding. What can you offer us that this human has not already given? Tradition, heritage, your birthright." Thorn looked at the 4 cubs. "Among humans you will never be more than outsiders. Interesting pets for them to show their compassion. With us you will be what you were born to be." Reed spoke up. "I've been reading human history. They have a tradition called adoption, taking in children not their blood and raising them as their own. They do this frequently. It's considered normal." "It's considered insanity by most species," Thorn said. "Caring for bloodlines not your own wastes resources. Or it builds stronger communities," Dan said. "Look, I get that you want them back with Draconeth. I understand that. But they get to choose. They're people, not property." Thorn's tail lashed. "In Draconeth culture, cubs do not choose until they come of age. That is years away yet." "In human culture, we let kids have a voice in their own lives," Dan countered. The standoff might have continued except Finn stepped forward. "General, respectfully, we know you want to protect us. We know you served our parents. But Dan fed us when we were starving. He risked his life fighting hunters. He gave up his freedom to keep us safe. In Draconeth culture, what do we call someone who guards a clutch not their own?" Thorn was silent for a long moment. "An oath guardian. But that bond requires sacrifice," Lyra interrupted. "The oath guardian must prove they will put the clutch above all else, including their own life. Has Dan not done this?" "The bond requires acceptance from the clutch," Thorn said slowly. All 4 dragons moved to stand beside Dan. Pip took his hand. "We accept him," Lyra said formally. "By ancient law, we name Dan Rivers as our oath guardian until we reach majority." Thorn looked at his warriors. They seemed as surprised as he was. "This is irregular. An alien has never—" "The law does not specify species," Reed said. "I've memorized the old texts. It says the clutch may choose any being who proves worthy through sacrifice and protection." Thorn studied Dan for a long moment. "You understand what this means, human? If they name you Oath Guardian and I accept it, you are bound to them until they reach adulthood. You cannot abandon them. You must put their needs above your own. In Draconeth culture, this is a sacred responsibility. I've been doing that already," Dan said simply. Thorn's scarred face showed something that might have been respect. "Perhaps. But the bond must be tested. Draconeth law allows challenge. I challenge your worthiness to guard the royal clutch. Face me in combat. If you survive, I accept the bond. If you fall, the cubs come with me." Dan felt his mouth go dry. Fight a dragon warrior twice his size with decades of combat experience? That wasn't a test. That was execution with extra steps. But he looked at the 4 dragons beside him, at Pip's trusting eyes, at Lyra's desperate hope, at Reed and Finn standing firm. "All right," Dan said. "Let's do this." Ruth stepped forward. "This is insane. Dan, you don't have to—" "Yeah," Dan said. "I really do." The fight was set for the next day in the colony's main square. Dan spent the night preparing as best he could, which meant acknowledging he was probably going to die. He wrote letters to Orin, to Ruth, to the 4 dragons. He made arrangements for his ship to go to Orin if he didn't survive. When dawn came, half the colony had turned out to watch. Dan faced Thorn across 20 meters of open ground. The dragon looked even bigger up close. "You still have time to withdraw," Thorn offered. "No, I don't," Dan said. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. Dan got in a few good hits, used every dirty trick he knew, and fought with everything he had. It wasn't enough. Thorn was stronger, faster, more experienced. Dan ended up on the ground, bleeding from multiple wounds, barely conscious. Thorn stood over him. "You fought well for a human, but not well enough." Then 4 young dragons threw themselves at the general, screaming. They couldn't stop him, but they tried anyway, desperate to protect Dan. Thorn caught them easily, holding them back without hurting them. He looked at Dan, then at the cubs struggling in his grip. "Enough," Thorn said. "The bond is proven." He released the cubs. They ran to Dan, checking his injuries, crying. "You fought knowing you would lose," Thorn said. "You fought anyway because they needed you to. That is the essence of an oath guardian." He knelt down, bringing his scarred face level with Dan's battered one. "I accept the bond. The cubs are yours to guard, human. And should you need it, the Draconith remnant stands with you." Dan managed a weak smile. "Does this mean we're friends now?" "It means I will train them in Draconith ways while you train them in yours," Thorn said. "And when the consortium comes, as they will, we will face them together." Ruth helped Dan to his feet. "You're bleeding pretty badly." "Worth it," Dan said, watching the 4 dragons huddle together, still worried about him despite everything. Pip broke away and hugged Dan's leg carefully, mindful of his injuries. "Don't ever do that again." "No promises," Dan said. He looked at Thorn. "When will they come?" "Soon," Thorn said. "They have assembled a fleet. They will demand surrender of the cubs, or they will enforce a blockade." Dan nodded. His body hurt everywhere, but his mind was clear. "Then we prepare." "We?" Ruth asked. "All of us," Dan said, looking at the assembled colonists. "Humans, Draconith. Anyone who thinks children shouldn't be used as leverage. We make a stand here." The crowd erupted in cheers. Dan let himself smile through the pain. He'd come to New Perth as a fugitive. Now he was part of something bigger, something that might actually change things, all because 4 starving kids had asked for leftovers. Funny how life worked out sometimes. 12 days after General Thorn's challenge, the consortium fleet arrived at New Perth. 15 ships, more than enough to enforce a complete blockade. They positioned themselves around the planet like a cage, blocking all shipping lanes in and out. Within hours, supply ships bound for the colony were being turned away. Dan stood in the colony's command center with Ruth, Oren, and General Thorn, watching the displays. The 4 dragon cubs sat quietly in the corner, trying to appear brave. Pip kept looking at Dan like he might have answers that would make this all go away. "They're not shooting," Ruth observed. "That's something." "They don't need to," Thorn said grimly. "They'll starve the colony slowly. Make everyone suffer until the people beg to hand over the cubs themselves." "They miscalculated," Oren said. She was monitoring communications channels. "Ships are arriving from other human colonies. Not military ships, just civilian ones. Traders, merchants, family ships. They're sitting outside the blockade line." Ruth pulled up the external view. Sure enough, dozens of human vessels were gathering just beyond the consortium's perimeter. More were arriving every hour. A message came through on the main channel. Dan recognized the ship designation. It was from Earth itself, the human homeworld. The message was simple and public, broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Ambassador Lee of Earth's unified government. The consortium blockade of New Perth is noted. We remind the consortium that New Perth is a sovereign human colony. Any action that results in civilian casualties will be considered an act of war against humanity. Earth's fleet is currently 6 days away at maximum speed. We recommend diplomatic resolution." 6 days, Ruth said. "That's not much time." "It's enough for people to starve," Thorn observed. "The consortium knows Earth won't actually start a war over this. It's a bluff." "Maybe," Dan said. But he was watching the growing collection of civilian ships. Or maybe it's not about Earth's military. More messages started coming in. Other human colonies declaring support. Independent traders refusing to honor consortium contracts. Human workers across the galaxy beginning strikes in protest. Within 24 hours, it had become clear that humanity was responding to the blockade, not with military force, but with something stranger. Unity. Lyra was studying the reports with Reed. I don't understand. These humans have no connection to us. Why are they risking their jobs, their safety? Reed, who'd been reading everything he could find about human psychology, looked up from his datapad. Because to them, you're children being threatened. Humans have a strong protective instinct toward young beings. It triggers something deep in their evolution. And more than that, they see this as a matter of principle. The consortium is a powerful entity trying to bully a smaller group into surrender. Humans apparently have very strong feelings about that. They're being illogical, Finn said, but he didn't sound convinced. Supporting us hurts their interests. Not if their interest is living in a galaxy where children aren't used as leverage, Dan said quietly. Sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same. Humans usually pick the right thing anyway. On the third day of the blockade, something unexpected happened. A ship emerged from hyperspace broadcasting Draconeth codes. But this wasn't General Thorne's small delegation. This was a fleet. 20 warships bearing the insignia of the Dragon Watch, the elite military force everyone thought had died in the plague. A voice came over the communications channel, powerful and commanding. This is Wing Marshal Kess of the Dragon Watch. We were deep in unexplored space when the plague struck our homeworld. We've spent 30 years searching for survivors. Imagine our surprise to learn the royal heirs are alive and being threatened by corporate mercenaries. The Dragon Watch returns. Who dares threaten the children of fire? The consortium fleet's formation wavered. The Dragon Watch had a reputation that survived even 30 years of absence. They were the most feared military force the galaxy had ever seen. General Thorne stood up from his seat, scales bristling with emotion. I thought you were all dead. Clearly not, came Kess's reply. General Thorne, it's good to hear your voice. Status of the Royal Cubs? Safe. Under protection of their Oath Guardian, a human named Dan Rivers, and the colony of New Perth. There was a pause. A human Oath Guardian? That's unusual. The circumstances were unusual, Thorne said. The bond was properly challenged and accepted. The Cubs chose him. Another pause, longer this time. We would speak with this human and the Cubs. Dan found himself on a video call with a dragon whose scales bore the marks of countless battles. Wing Marshal Kess looked at him with eyes that had seen centuries of war. You're the human who started all this, Kess said. It wasn't a question. I fed some hungry kids, Dan replied. Everything else just happened. You understand the Cubs' importance? What they represent? I understand they're children who deserve to grow up safe and happy, Dan said. Everything else is politics. Kess's expression was unreadable. General Thorne says you accepted the Oath Guardian bond, that you fought him knowing you would lose. Why? Because the alternative was letting them be taken by someone who saw them as assets instead of kids. Dan gestured to where the 4 dragons sat nearby. They've been through enough. They deserve someone who cares about them, not about what they represent. Kess was silent for a long moment. Then she said, bring the Cubs. I would speak with them. The 4 young dragons approached the screen nervously. Kess studied each of them in turn. Princess Lyra, you've grown since I last saw you as a hatchling. You have your mother's eyes. Lyra's tail twitched with emotion. You knew my mother? I served her for 70 years. She was the finest leader I ever knew. Kess looked at the other 3. Prince Reed, Prince Finn, Princess Pip. Your parents would be proud of how you've survived. We didn't survive alone, Reed said. Dan protected us, so I've heard. Tell me, do you wish to return to Draconeth care? The Dragon Watch can provide safety, training, everything you need to prepare for your future roles. The 4 Cubs looked at each other, then at Dan. Lyra spoke for all of them. With respect, Wing Marshal, we choose to stay with our Oath Guardian. General Thorne has agreed to help train us in our heritage, but Dan is family now. We won't leave him. Kess nodded slowly. I see. The bond is truly made then. She looked at Dan again. Human, the Dragon Watch was created to protect the royal bloodline. For 30 years, we've had no one to protect. Now we find the heirs alive, bonded to an alien, living on a human colony and facing threats from the consortium. It's not what we expected. Nothing about this situation has been expected, Dan said. No, Kess agreed. But perhaps that's fitting. The old ways died with the plague. Maybe new ways are needed. She leaned forward. The Dragon Watch recognizes Lyra and her siblings as the legitimate heirs. We recognize the Oath Guardian bond, unusual as it is. And we stand with New Perth against this blockade. Any who threaten the royal cubs threaten us. The consortium fleet began retreating within the hour. 20 Dragonwatch warships was more than they wanted to face, especially with Earth's fleet, approaching and human unity spreading across the galaxy. But before they left completely, a single shuttle approached New Perth with a white flag. A consortium representative requested a meeting with Dan and the Cubs. They met in the colony's administration building. The representative was a sleek alien whose species Dan didn't recognize, wearing expensive corporate attire. "This has escalated beyond anyone's intentions," the representative said smoothly. "The consortium simply wished to ensure the Draconeth heirs were properly cared for. We see now that they are. We're prepared to withdraw all claims and even offer financial support for their upbringing." "In exchange for what?" Ruth asked suspiciously. "Future trade considerations. First contact opportunities when the Draconeth nation reforms. Nothing unreasonable." Lyra stepped forward. "You mean you want leverage over us? You want us grateful and indebted so that when we have power, we remember who helped us?" The representative smiled. "That's a very cynical way to look at a generous offer, Princess." "It's an accurate way," Lyra said. "I refuse. We owe you nothing. We want nothing from you." "You're young," the representative said. "You don't understand how galactic politics work. I understand that you were willing to starve an entire colony to get control of me and my siblings," Lyra said coldly. "I understand that you see everything as assets and leverage. When I come of age and take my place in Draconeth society, I'll remember this. The consortium will never have what it wants from us." The representative's expression hardened. "You're making enemies, little dragon." "She already had enemies," Dan said. "You were one of them from the start. Now leave." After they'd gone, Ruth let out a long breath. "That's going to have consequences." "Everything has consequences," Dan said. "But some things are worth it." That night, Dan found the 4 cubs in the garden area the colony had created. It wasn't much, just some transplanted vegetation and artificial sunlight. But the cubs loved it. They were sitting together, talking quietly. "Can we talk to you?" Lyra asked when she noticed Dan. He sat down with them. "What's on your mind?" "We could have gone with Wing Marshal Kess," Reed said. "The Dragon Watch would protect us. We'd learn our heritage, prepare for our roles. It would be logical. But we chose to stay here," Finn continued. "With you, with humans. We just wanted you to know we understand what that costs you." "It costs us too," Pip added quietly. "We'll never be fully Draconeth if we grow up here. We'll never be fully human either. We'll be something in between." "Is that a bad thing?" Dan asked. "I don't know," Lyra admitted. "But I know I'd rather be in between with you than fully Draconeth with someone who sees me as a princess first and a person second." She looked at her siblings. "We all would." Dan felt something tight in his chest loosen. "You know I'm going to mess up, right? I've never been a parent. I don't know Draconeth culture. I'm learning as I go." "We're learning too," Reed said. "How to be people instead of heirs. How to choose our own path. You're teaching us that just by being you. Besides," Finn added with a grin, "you feed us good food and let us blow things up in the engineering bay. You're the best guardian ever." Pip climbed into Dan's lap without asking, the way the little dragon always did when feeling emotional. "Are you really our dad now? Like human families have?" Dan thought about it. About a derelict station and 4 starving voices asking for leftovers. About choosing to protect them even when it cost him everything. About fighting a dragon warrior knowing he'd lose. About all the small moments since then, teaching Pip to read, listening to Reed's endless questions, watching Finn's experiments, helping Lyra work through the weight of being the eldest. "Yeah," Dan said. "I really am." The 4 dragons piled onto him, nearly knocking him over in their enthusiasm. They stayed that way for a long time, a human and 4 dragon children watching the artificial stars of the colony garden. Outside, the Dragon Watch fleet held position. Human ships gathered in solidarity. The galaxy was watching and talking and choosing sides. But in that moment, none of that mattered. A family sat together in a garden, and that was enough. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The consortium wouldn't forget this. Political tensions would rise. Decisions would need to be made about the Cubs' future. But tonight they were just a dad and his kids, and that was all any of them needed. Dan looked down at 4 sleeping dragons and smiled. He'd started this journey as a salvage runner looking for spare parts. He'd found something far more valuable. He'd found family, and he'd fight the whole galaxy if he had to keep them safe. 5 years changed everything. Dan stood in the crowded observation gallery of the Galactic Council station, watching through the massive viewport as delegates from across the known galaxy gathered for the first major session since the Draconeth catastrophe. He wore formal clothes that felt wrong after years of casual colony life, but Lyra had insisted. Today was important. The 4 cubs weren't cubs anymore. Lyra had grown into a young adult dragon, her blue scales gleaming with health, and her gold markings now prominent along her neck and wings. She carried herself with natural authority that would have made her parents proud. Reed had become a scholar, his green scales marked with silver tracers that appeared as Draconeth matured intellectually. Finn's bronze scales now sparked with barely contained energy, his electromagnetic abilities stronger and more controlled. And Pip, no longer the tiny silver dragonling who'd hidden behind Dan's leg, had grown into a sleek young dragon with scales that shimmered like starlight. They'd spent 5 years on New Perth, learning both human and Draconeth ways. General Thorne had established a permanent training facility on the colony, teaching the 4 cubs their heritage while they attended human schools and played with human children. Wing Marshal Kess and the Dragon Watch maintained a protective presence, but integrated with the colony rather than isolating the cubs. It had been messy and complicated and beautiful. The cubs learned calculus alongside ancient Draconeth battle strategies. They celebrated both human holidays and traditional dragon ceremonies. They grew up bilingual, bicultural, belonging to both worlds and neither. And now, at 19 by human years and recognized as adults by Draconeth law, they were ready to take their place in galactic society. Lyra had requested time to address the Galactic Council, and after much political wrangling they'd agreed. The council was curious about what the lost heirs had become. Dan spotted Orin in the crowd. She'd become head of security for New Perth and had accompanied them to the council station. Ruth was there too, now representing New Perth officially as the colony had grown and gained recognition. General Thorne stood with other Draconeth survivors who'd slowly emerged from hiding over the past 5 years, forming the core of a reformed Draconeth nation. Wing Marshal Kess commanded respect from the military observers present. "You look nervous," Orin said, coming to stand beside Dan. "She's my kid," Dan said. "First big speech in front of the entire galaxy. Of course I'm nervous." "She's a princess," addressing the council that ignored her people's destruction, Orin corrected. "But yeah, she's also your kid. It's a strange combination." The council chamber below was filling up. Representatives from hundreds of species took their seats. The consortium had a delegation present, though they'd kept a low profile since the blockade incident. Earth's ambassador sat in the human section, which had grown significantly as humanity expanded and unified in response to the dragon crisis. The council speaker called the session to order. "We recognize Princess Lyra of the Draconeth Royal House." Lyra entered the chamber from a side door, her siblings walking beside her in formation. They'd agreed she would speak, but they would stand together. Dan noticed she was wearing a scarf around her neck, blue and silver, embroidered with symbols from both Draconeth and human cultures. He recognized it as one Pip had made for her last birthday. Lyra approached the central podium. Every eye in the chamber was on her. "5 years ago," she began, her voice clear and strong, "my siblings and I were dying on an abandoned station. We'd been running our entire lives, hiding from enemies who wanted us dead for political reasons we barely understood. We were alone, starving, and losing hope. Then a human salvage runner found us. We asked if we could eat his leftovers." She paused, letting that sink in. Dan saw representatives shifting uncomfortably. Everyone knew the story, but hearing it laid out so plainly was different. Dan Rivers had nothing to gain from helping us. He was a salvage operator barely making ends meet. Helping us cost him his salvage license, his ship, his freedom, and nearly his life. But he did it anyway because to humans, when someone asks for help, you give it. That's their way. Reed stepped forward slightly, adding, "We spent 5 years living among humans on New Perth. We learned about their history, their culture, their values. We learned that humans have a strange habit of caring about beings that aren't their species. They domesticated animals and called them family. They formed bonds across genetic lines. They adopted children who weren't their blood and loved them as their own. To most species, this behavior seems irrational." Finn continued. "We learned that humans organize into family groups that protect and nurture their young, often at great cost to themselves. We learned that they value compassion and protection of the vulnerable as virtues, not weaknesses. We learned that they'll face superior forces if the cause is right, even when the logical choice is to surrender." Pip spoke last, her voice younger but no less certain. "We learned what it means to have a family that chooses you, not just one you're born into. Dan Rivers became our father not because of law or biology, but because he made that choice every day for 5 years. The colony of New Perth became our home not because we were royalty, but because they saw us as children who needed protection." Lyra took over again. "The Draconeth fell because we became isolated. We positioned ourselves as mediators, as outsiders to every conflict. We were respected but not beloved. When the plague came, few mourned us, fewer helped. That isolation killed us as surely as the disease." She looked around the chamber. "My siblings and I are the future of the Draconeth nation. We will rebuild our people, preserve our heritage, and reclaim our place in this galaxy. But we will do it differently than our ancestors. We learned from humans that strength isn't just power, it's connection. That family isn't just blood, it's choice. That the willingness to protect the vulnerable isn't weakness, it's the highest form of courage." There was absolute silence in the chamber now. Lyra's voice rang clear. "Today I announce the formation of the Draconeth Human Alliance. My people and the humans will stand together as equals and friends. We will work to build a galaxy where children aren't used as leverage, where the weak are protected, where compassion matters as much as strength." She turned to look up at the observation gallery, her blue eyes finding Dan. "And I want to say something to one human specifically. To the salvage operator who found 4 starving cubs and changed the course of history by sharing his lunch. To the man who fought a dragon warrior knowing he'd lose just to prove he cared enough to try. To our oath guardian, our teacher, our protector, and our father." Dan felt his eyes burning. He knew what was coming. "Thank you, Dad," Lyra said. "Thank you for feeding us when we were hungry. Thank you for protecting us when we were hunted. Thank you for loving us when we were lost. Everything we are, everything we'll build starts with that simple act of kindness on a dark station 5 years ago." The chamber erupted, not in applause, which wasn't protocol, but in delicate standing, in murmured conversations, in visible emotion crossing alien faces. The human section was openly crying, which made other species uncomfortable but fascinated. Then something happened that broke every rule of council protocol. Pip launched herself from the floor, wings spreading as she flew up to the observation gallery. She crashed through the barrier meant to keep observers separate and tackled Dan in a hug that nearly knocked him off his feet. Reed and Finn followed, climbing rather than flying, but no less enthusiastic. Security started forward, but Wing Marshal Kess waved them off. Lyra took a more dignified path, walking up the stairs, but she was grinning as she joined her siblings in piling onto their human father. "You're supposed to stay down there," Dan said, laughing and crying at the same time. "This is a formal council session." "Don't care," Pip said, refusing to let go. "You were crying. We don't let you cry alone." The entire Galactic Council watched as the Royal Draconeth heirs completely abandoned protocol to comfort their adoptive human parent. Cameras captured every moment, broadcasting it across the galaxy. An old elven delegate leaned toward Earth's ambassador. "I'm beginning to understand humans better. You're completely irrational and it somehow works." Earth's ambassador smiled. "We prefer to think of it as having our priorities straight. Family first, politics second." Down in the chamber, the consortium representative looked disgusted. "This is absurd. Royal heirs behaving like common children, abandoning dignity for sentiment." A Draconeth representative, one of Thorne's colleagues, turned to him. "That's where you're wrong. They haven't abandoned dignity. They've redefined it. And that, I think, is what truly frightens you. A galaxy that values compassion over profit is bad for your business. In the observation gallery, Dan finally extracted himself from the dragon pile enough to breathe. You all have to go back down there. Lyra has more to say. Do I? Lyra asked innocently. You prepared a whole speech about the future of Draconeth human cooperation, Reed said. I memorized it. You're only 40% through. Can we do it later? Finn asked. This is more important. Dan looked at his 4 children, all grown but still needing him in the ways that mattered. The galaxy is watching. Let them watch, Lyra said. Let them see what matters to us. Let them see that being royal doesn't mean forgetting how to be family. She turned back to the council chamber below and raised her voice. The galaxy wants to know what kind of leaders the new Draconeth generation will be. This is your answer. We are leaders who know that protecting our people starts with valuing every individual. We are royalty who understand that power without compassion is tyranny. We are the children of 2 worlds, raised in both Draconeth tradition and human values. And we believe that combination makes us stronger than either culture alone. She looked at the assembled delegates. The alliance between Draconeth and humanity is built on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that family isn't limited by biology. We invite any species who shares these values to join us. Together, we can build a galaxy that protects the vulnerable, values compassion, and remembers that behind every political decision are real lives that matter. The session dissolved into chaos as delegates rushed to discuss this new development. Some were intrigued, others were horrified, but everyone was talking about it, and that was the point. Hours later, back on their ship preparing to return to New Perth, the 5 of them sat in the common area. The formal clothes were gone, replaced by comfortable colony wear. Pip was asleep across Dan's lap again, just like old times despite being far too big for it now. You know this changes everything, Oren said, reviewing the news feeds. Every major outlet is covering it. The image of you 4 breaking protocol to hug your dad is everywhere. Humans are calling it the best thing they've ever seen. Other species don't know what to make of it. Good, Lyra said. Let them be confused. Let them question their assumptions. That's how change starts. Ruth pulled up a message on her datapad. Earth's government officially recognizes the Draconeth Human Alliance. 12 other human colonies have sent similar messages. We've also got interest from 3 non-human species who want to learn more about the alliance. The consortium is threatening sanctions, Reed reported from his own datapad. They're claiming we're destabilizing established galactic order. We are, Finn said cheerfully. That's the fun part. General Thorne appeared on the view screen. Wing Marshal Kess and I have been discussing the military implications of this alliance. The Dragon Watch is prepared to begin joint training with human forces. We're curious about your combat philosophy. It's mostly stubborn refusal to give up, Oren said, and protecting our people at any cost. Sounds familiar, Thorne said with what might have been a dragon smile. We'll get along well. Dan listened to them all planning and discussing, watching his 4 children coordinate the beginning of something bigger than any of them. They'd grown so much. Lyra was a natural diplomat. Reed was already writing treaties and policy papers. Finn had designed new communication systems that were being adopted across human space. Pip was becoming a symbol of hope for younger beings everywhere. Proof that you could start small and scared and still grow into something strong. They'd come so far from that dark station, from 4 voices asking for leftovers. What are you thinking? Lyra asked, noticing his expression. That I went looking for salvage 5 years ago and found something much more valuable, Dan said. And that I'm proud of all of you. We learned from the best, Reed said. I'm not that great, Dan protested. You're exactly that great, Finn said. You taught us that the most important thing isn't power or position or protocol. It's being there for the people who need you. Doing the right thing even when it's hard. Protecting those who can't protect themselves. Pip stirred without waking, mumbling something in her sleep. Dan gently adjusted her position so she'd be more comfortable. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, Lyra said. Building an alliance. Reforming Draconeth society. Navigating galactic politics. It's going to be complicated. It already is complicated, Ruth pointed out. But worth it, Oren added. You're changing the galaxy. Making it a place where kids don't have to die alone on abandoned stations. Where being different doesn't mean being alone, where family can be chosen, not just born into. Dan looked around at all of them. His children, his friends, his found family. Human and Draconith working together, building something new. You know what, he said. 5 years ago, if someone had told me I'd end up as the adoptive father of 4 dragon royals, starting an interspecies alliance and giving the Galactic Council an existential crisis,
I'd have laughed. And now?
Lyra asked. Now I wouldn't change a single thing, Dan said. Well, maybe I'd have brought more snacks to that first meeting. You 4 ate everything I had. They all laughed. Even Pip woke up enough to giggle sleepily before dozing off again. Outside the viewport, stars streaked past as they traveled home to New Perth. The galaxy was changing, slowly but surely. Not through conquest or force, but through the simple radical act of caring about each other across species lines. It had started with 4 starving children asking for help and 1 human who couldn't walk away. It had grown into something that would reshape galactic civilization. But at its core, it was still just family, still just a father and his children, looking out for each other and facing the universe together. And that, Dan thought, was exactly how it should be. Somewhere in the galaxy, other children were scared and alone and hoping for help. Because of what had started here, maybe more people would stop and help them. Maybe more families would form across species lines. Maybe compassion would become the rule instead of the exception. It was a nice thought, worth fighting for. Dan looked down at Pip, sleeping peacefully in his lap, safe and loved. At Lyra discussing policy with Ruth. At Reed and Finn arguing cheerfully about some technical detail. Yeah, he thought, definitely worth fighting for. The ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying them home. Behind them, the galaxy was already beginning to change. One choice, one connection, one act of kindness at a time. And it all started because someone asked for leftovers, and someone else decided to share everything they had. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. 10 years later, Dan would stand in this same spot on a different ship, watching his children lead fleets and negotiate treaties and change the face of galactic civilization. He'd see the Draconith-Human Alliance expand to include 17 species. He'd watch schools open that taught both compassion and strength, where children of different species learned together. He'd see the consortium broken up after investigations revealed the extent of their crimes, including the plague that nearly destroyed the Draconeth. He'd see Pip become an ambassador who specialized in helping lost children find homes. He'd see Finn revolutionize galactic technology with innovations that combined Draconeth and human engineering. He'd see Reed write the new galactic charter that enshrined protection of the vulnerable as a fundamental right. He'd see Lyra crowned as the leader of a reformed Draconeth nation, one built on connection rather than isolation. He'd see all of that and more. But it would all trace back to this moment, to this journey home, to the decision he'd made on a dark station when 4 voices asked for help. And he'd remember what Wing Marshal Kess once told him, after watching him with the Cubs for a year. Humans have a saying, I believe. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. You planted something 5 years ago, Dan Rivers. We're all going to live in the shade of that tree for generations to come. Dan smiled at the memory that hadn't happened yet, then focused on the present, on Pip sleeping in his lap, on his other 3 children planning their future with the optimism only young adults could have, on the journey home to New Perth where a colony full of humans and Draconeth waited for them. The galaxy could wait. Right now he was just a dad with his kids heading home, and that was more than enough.